Hello, this is Wayne Ferreira, and I'm going to be talking through AQA Psychology A-Level Attachment Paper 1, the topic specifically Bowlby's maternal deprivation. Now, what you need to kind of be aware of, obviously, it may not kind of be clear to you, but Bowlby is mentioned more than once in the specification. We see Bowlby has a theory, or his explanation for attachment, and we also now have Bowlby's theory of maternal deprivation. They are considered to be different parts of the course, so therefore look out for specific type of questions. Before we start, I'm going to talk about maternal deprivation. It says here it's the emotional and intellectual consequences of separation. Okay, and so what is a kind of a focus of this is, of course, these two things: emotional and intellectual consequences. Keyword here: consequences of separation from the mother. Okay, and he published this work in 1951, where he published the theory of maternal deprivation. Prior to this, he had been working with kind of children. We see one of the studies that he may have looked at is the 44 Thieves. He's looking at kind of how these children are affected by deprivation, and this is a lot earlier to his explanations of attachment. So what he wanted to talk about is how the continued presence of the mother, or the nurturing from the mother, is essential for normal development. So that's a key phrase here. He's looking at this idea of normal psychological development. What we need here is essential nurturing of the mother. Now, of course, he will later go on to be open to this idea that it's the primary attachment figure. And what I like about this is it says here that the mother's love is as essential to the baby as vitamins and proteins are to physical health. And this is a real key importance, where there's a big shift away from understanding that children only need physical care, and that they now need emotional care as well. So therefore, what Bowlby then goes on to say is that if they don't have this mother love, so if they're deprived of this mother love, there are going to be consequences. Okay, and the consequences are quite clear to him, that there's going to be short-term consequences. So this is seen as distress, and he worked previously with Robertson at the PDD model, protest, despair, detachment. But we also see the idea that there could be clinginess, aggression, and attention-seeking behavior from children who are deprived of their mother's love. But in terms of long-term deprivation, he talks about depression, delinquency, and this thing called an affectionate psychopath. So delinquency is kind of very similar to this idea of somebody who repeatedly kind of gets in trouble with authorities. But this affectionate psychopathy is determined by the inability to feel affection or care about others. Okay, it's also linked to this idea of psychopathy, where there's no real understanding of social consequences. In other words, right and wrong. And so this is quite important here. So the first thing we talk about in terms of this deprivation is this idea that there are short-term and long-term consequences. Okay, he also makes that it clear later on, certainly, that it's not just separation from the mother in terms of physical separation, but it can actually be that the mother is there, but because of things like depression, postpartum depression and things like that, that could also be important to us. Now, he goes on to kind of argue that it's this deprivation of the mother's love, and he's able to at least acknowledge that a substitute carer could also give that emotional care that the child is lacking. But of course, any extended separations are going to cause harm. And you know, in terms of his explanation of attachment, he talks about the accumulation of separations should ultimately be zero. But what we're hoping here is that it's this emotional care that the child is lacking. And hopefully, if somebody else is providing it, the child will not kind of have these serious consequences. He adds on to his understanding of the deprivation model, this idea of the critical period. He directly borrows this from Harlow and Lorenz and people like that, and he includes this in his attachment explanation as well. But he says that in terms of maternal deprivation, that damage is inevitable. Now, that's quite a loaded statement. So he's saying that basically, if the child has kind of this kind of care kind of taken away from them. So if they're deprived of emotional care, and it means that the damage is going to be inevitable during this critical period of from birth to 2.5 years. And so after 2.5 years, the child is likely to kind of be damaged. He also says that there's a sensitive period in terms up to 5 years, and where the child will kind of also be at risk. And then another key element of this particular theory is this idea that it's irreversible. So if the child has experienced this, they'll not be able to overcome it. And that's going to be important for one of our evaluation points later. Now, just to make it a little bit clearer in terms of Bowlby's maternal deprivation hypothesis, and also kind of this idea of maternal deprivation, I've kind of highlighted the effects of development. So the first one is intellectual development. So Bowlby believed that children who are deprived are going to have delayed intellectual development, and this is important. Now, he took a lot of this research from Goldfarb, who later on prior to this, later to his 1944 study, looked at children who were fostered and how that they had lower IQs. The second aspect of what happens when you're deprived of maternal care is your emotional development. And of course, this is the affectional psychopathy that he was talking about. And so the lack of affection, lack of guilt and empathy that these children would have if they have been deprived. Now, this is not specifically Bowlby's maternal deprivation hypothesis, but it's worth noting, and I've included this kind of prior to my evaluation, because what we're going to see is that one of the criticisms is on how Bowlby comes up with his theory. But you could argue that this is research support. This is research that he could use to support his theory. And he did this research in 1944, where he's looked at 44 thieves. So he had 44 criminal teenagers who had been arrested for stealing, and they were kind of interviewed for signs of this affectional psychopathy that I've mentioned previously. Their families were also interviewed, and we also wanted to find out whether they'd had prolonged separations. Okay? And what he is able to do is to have a contrast group or control group that weren't criminals but were emotionally disturbed. So in other words, they were kind of in the system for kind of being kind of troubled, kind of with their kind of emotional developments as well. But they were clearly not thieves. So you could say ultimately we got 88 people in his particular study. But what we find here is a quite clear contrast, that out of the thieves, a significant number, 14 of them, were considered to be affectionate psychopaths. That's quite a large percentage. He then goes into those 14, and we see that 12 of them, so that's like a very high percentage now, of them actually had prolonged separations. But we see that the other thieves didn't have those prolonged separations. We look at the control group, and we only find 2 of them had long separations as well. And so he does conclude from this study that prolonged early separation causes this thing called affectional psychopathy. So he does pretty much say that this is the root cause of these children's problems. Okay, so as I said, this is an additional kind of piece of work. I would probably not include it in the knowledge part of any essay if I was given an essay for this, but I certainly would consider maybe using it as research to support Bowlby's maternal deprivation hypothesis. But what we're going to see is that this is not the best research to use, okay? Because my first point, and so therefore if you do include Bowlby's 44 Thieves, is you need to start with kind of criticizing it as your counter argument to it. And we see that the evidence is considered to be poor quality because of design flaws. Also a bit of Goldfarb's research is also could be included on this, and so therefore it's important for us to kind of understand why this is a problem. So it says here, Bowlby carried out the research, so therefore he could have been biased. Okay, we also know that that the children that he used had been in the Second World War. And this is where Goldfarb's research was also including children of that particular stage, kind of looking at their low IQ and things like that. Okay, and so therefore we got to argue that if Bowlby was looking at these 44 thieves and Goldfarb was looking at those particular children, the trauma could have actually been the reason why they were unable to kind of develop normally. Okay, so we said the poor aftercare and children growing up in poor quality institutions may actually be the reason why they were kind of affectionate psychopaths or showing kind of that emotional damage that they would have had. So therefore that's a major criticism of the 44 thieves. So what we are then arguing that it's not prolonged separation that has caused it, but actually these other factors, and that's quite an important criticism of the 44 thieves. But if we are not happy with just being critical of how Bowlby kind of carried out his research, a very important person to take note of is Hilda Lewis, because it's a very similar time frame, 1954, tries to find that link between prolonged separations and criminality, effectively what Bowlby had said with his 44 Thieves study. And what we have here is that there is no kind of links. In other words, it's kind of an idea. It's not quite a replication, but it is trying to look at the same type of thing, this time with a much larger group of children, and we see that there is no prediction of criminality or any type of difficulty forming relationships based on their prolonged separation. So really important to remember Hilda Lewis. So what this then produces is this idea that the maternal deprivation kind of hypothesis is kind of flawed, because there could be other factors that could have easily have explained kind of Bowlby's outcome. And so therefore it's important for us to kind of question kind of how these flaws mean that we need to question Bowlby's original research. Okay, so there we have. So we have research that supports it in 44 Thieves, where criticisms of the 44 Thieves, but then ultimately kind of the death blow is Hilda Lewis saying, look, there's no link here. There must be other factors. However, I'm not going to leave it there. And what we can also look at is that, Bowlby may have actually hit on something that's quite important. And so I've got two pieces of research that might indicate that actually there are some issues relating to maternal deprivation. So first of all, looking at baby rats being separated from their mothers for a single day, okay, had a permanent effect on their development. Okay, now I don't know what one day in a rat's life would be compared to human life, but of course it is significant. Now many of you might look at this and go, well, that's animals, how can that relate to human beings? So let's kind of relate it to human beings. So some kind of more recent research said poor quality maternal care was associated with high levels of psychopathy in adults. And so it does appear that what we need to kind of recognize is that having kind of poor quality care is problematic for all children. And I suppose Harlow would have predicted this with his monkeys and the abs of kind of what happened to those monkeys once they reached adulthood. Okay, so and though Bowlby's evidence may be flimsy or maybe flawed, there could actually be some kind of research out there that can support his work, and so we don't kind of completely dismiss Bowlby's deprivation hypothesis. However, there's perhaps a bigger concern that we need to look at, and this is whether Bowlby actually was looking at deprivation or potentially was he looking at privation. Now, in terms of privation, what we have here is it's slightly different because it says that there's no emotional care. Okay, and so in other words, what we have is that you're probably unlikely to have formed a bond. So it's failure to form an attachment bond. Okay, and so this criticism builds up on this idea of, is there a difference between deprivation and privation? And what we have is Michael Rutter, who goes on to do a lot of really good research with the Romanian orphans and other people like that, said that Bowlby, perhaps when he was speaking about deprivation, was actually muddling the concepts together. Okay, so Rutter said that there's a difference between the two, that maybe having the absence of a primary attachment figure is possibly where the damage occurred in Bowlby's research. Okay, so maybe what we have here is that the absence of an attachment figure is kind of what Bowlby's deprivation hypothesis is all about. And so Rutter said that the severe long-term damage that Bowlby and Goldfarb and other people are talking about is more likely because of privation. What does this mean to the theory? It means that potentially the theory has some value to it, but perhaps there's a misunderstanding of what exactly it means. So maybe he overestimated deprivation and actually perhaps should have been looking at privation. Okay. Now, the last criticism is specifically about the critical period, and Bowlby was at least able to understand that having substitute care may actually be quite important, but it's this good aftercare that becomes important. And what I'm going to draw on is the Czech twins. Now, you might have come across the Czech twins when you're looking at case studies, or you might have come across a case study by Jeannie, and the case study of Jeannie does demonstrate that when you have kind of poor aftercare and kind of things happening within that aftercare, that the emotional damage kind of remains. But this was a specific case study looking at these two twins who their mother dies at an early age, and when the father remarries, the evil stepmother locks them in a cupboard and kind of basically causes them a lot of physical and emotional abuse over a long period of time. But they were then fully recovered and rescued and taken into care. Apparently, two lovely sisters looked after them, and they actually make a full recovery. And so it is possible that the critical period may not be as critical as Bowlby suggested, and that maybe it's not inevitable that the damage will happen. So if you can have some kind of emotional care within that sensitive period, perhaps the outcome is positive. Okay, so the last thing I want to mention is that if you have an opportunity to watch a film called A Home for Maisie, it was on the BBC probably about 15 years ago now. It will show how the combination of deprivation and privation and other kind of factors could really kind of trouble a young child. But it also shows how having psychological kind of therapy which kind of deal with those underlying causes could also be very supportive to you in the long run. Now, just looking at some quick questions. If we see the question says outline Bowlby's theory of maternal deprivation, the mark scheme indicates to us that you could define deprivation, but you could look at intellectual and emotional development, kind of what I've mentioned in terms of mine, and also you can refer to the critical period. So therefore, kind of following that kind of structure of the mark scheme could actually be quite helpful for you. We've got criticisms there, so looking at the evaluation points, we see the Hilda Lewis becomes quite important. We see Rutter's concern about deprivation versus privation is also important. And then the criticism about the sensitive period. But this last one here about the economic implications of the theory, I haven't mentioned that in mine, but we need to kind of consider that ultimately if your mother is going to cause you damage if they are separated from you, it is possibly used as socially sensitive research in which a lot of people felt that mothers had to return to home and look after the children as they're going to kind of have kind of negative impacts on their children's lives. And so therefore, if you are perhaps stopping working or not working because of it, this could have economic implications. And so therefore, important for Bowlby's maternal deprivation. Now, this is another 8 marker. Discuss Bowlby's theory of maternal deprivation. We see there that there's no reference to 44 thieves. We have to go through that first bit. It's really quite important that we focus our answer quite clearly. For 8 marks, I don't even know how much of 44 thieves I would actually mention. But then this last question is also really important for us to have a look at. We see that it's worth 16 marks, so it's a full kind of essay for us. We see that it says discuss Bowlby's theory of maternal deprivation, so therefore we have a large chunk of both knowledge and evaluation there. Okay, but then we also have to refer to Ryan. Okay, and so what I would focus on this is talking about what Bowlby's theory is. And then we'll apply it potentially to Ryan. So we see, for example, having been grown up in in care, has difficult relationships with parents, and so therefore showing things like maybe elements of the affectionate psychopathy. We have the delayed intellectual development in terms of school report. So if he's not doing well there, there's a possibility that he is kind of struggling intellectually. And then, of course, we have the antisocial behavior, which kind of links to the psychopathy that Bowlby would refer to. We then have an opportunity to evaluate and to talk about kind of how the particular theory may have its flaws or strengths in terms of research. And there we go. And that's it. Okay, thank you very much for listening. And I hope that you have enjoyed this lesson on Bowlby's maternal deprivation.